So today's presentation is called Uncommonly Known VIPs in North Omaha. You know, we're really going over in these presentations, we're going over the big themes. I've worked really hard to create new presentations for you each time, and it's important to me to, for my own like intellectual curiosity, I want to keep plowing the fields in new ways and just seeing if there's new things that emerge. But one of the things that I've always known in this work, you know, I've been researching and writing this stuff now for a long time, almost 15 years. And if we don't count my high school papers, which we should not, I made most of them up. So this is kind of my mea culpa. This is me making up for that. Anyway, in all of this time, one of the things that keeps standing out, and you already know this, because if you have any love or interest in the city's history, in Nebraska history, you already know what I'm about to say. But the long story short is this: the people from North Omaha are not recognized as the leaders that they have been for all of this time. Just off the top of your head, I would bet that each of you could list 6 great VIPs in North Omaha history. 6 out of hundreds.
Is this a test?
This is not a test. You will not be graded. However, Jill does have gold stars, and she'll hand them out if you give all the right answers. But think of your own list really quick. Think of the 6 people that come to your mind really fast who are VIPs from North Omaha. Define VIP however you want. It could be politics. It could be education. It could be community leaders. It could be athletes. It could be entertainment. It could be business, industry. I mean, so many different angles. Think of those 6 VIPs just off the top of your head. Somebody shout out one name real quick.
Bob Gibson.
Bob Gibson. Give me another one.
Gail Sayers.
Gail Sayers. Anybody else?
Preston Love.
Preston Love. Junior and senior.
Beasley.
Say that again.
Beasley, Gary.
Right? Beasley.
John Beasley.
John Beasley, the actor. So lots of people come to mind. And then we could think of our politicians, and we got Ernie.
No.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, Ernie.
Yeah, we got Ernie.
I mean, he is who he is. But it goes on. It turns out that there's been a lot of people from North Omaha who've been pretty darned important, if not to the entire state, if not to the entire city, then definitely to the entire community. Today, we're going to run through a lot of these. This is incomplete. I did not do a great job of putting this together because we have shortages of time. I would need about 5 hours to do a full presentation on the uncommonly known, very important people from North Omaha. But we're going to do kind of an introduction and see what you think and some of your responses. One of the things that I was really deliberate about doing when I put this together, as I am with all of the history work that I share, is making sure that the entire North Omaha community is represented as thoroughly as I can. Now, that said, your favorite person might not be in here in this presentation, and I want to know who they are. So when we get to the end, I'll have a chance for you to kind of answer that. I've also got a couple of did you know sections in here, so let's just rock and roll and see what happens. First thing, before we get started, can anybody here tell me who Dr. A.G. Edwards on the with the glasses on the side? I think it would be your right, your left. All right, Dr. A.G. Edwards. Anybody know who Dr. Edwards was?
Doctor in Omaha.
He was definitely a doctor in Omaha. Everybody here is related to North Omaha, so keep elaborating if you can.
First doctor.
So Edwards was actually like the 6th African-American doctor in North Omaha. However, he was the first one to notably serve white people. Like, white people came to him for service. And that was phenomenal for his era, which was around 1890 through about 1910 or 11. In the middle, this man holding the North Omaha Booster newspaper, his name was Bill Shulman. Does anybody recognize the name Bill Shulman? All right, Bill Shulman, he ran a plumbing company, not very exotic, but it was over by 24th and Ames. He was in the Saratoga neighborhood from about the 1920s to in the 1966 is when he passed. Bill Shulman was a huge civic booster. He was in all the clubs, did all the things, but he was almost solely responsible for getting the Mormon Bridge built in the 1950s when the first section opened up. He was so important. He had a group of 4 guys that he worked with, and they just busted the state and the feds until it was built. So kind of an important guy, but you never heard of him before. And then on the far right, then you have John Adams Jr. John Adams Jr. was an African-American lawyer, but does anybody know his civic role? He was the second African-American state legislator in Nebraska. The first was in 1892, and then there was a 28-year gap until the 1920s when John Adams Jr. was elected in. So these are important people, but people that you might never have heard of before, and that's why it's uncommonly known.
Adam, is he the one for whom Adams Park is named?
You would like to think that it was that good of a naming process, but in reality, he's not. It turns out that there was a bit of a competition that happened for that particular park, which, by the way, wasn't named until the 1950s. And it turned out to be a white businessman who lived over on Military Avenue, whose last name was Adams. So we want the park to be named for him, but it's not. Omaha. Okay, did you know? I just put these in here because I think they're interesting, but I'm a bit of a nerd that way. A famous German adventurer named Prince Maximilian of Wiedenhead. Jill, you're gonna have to say that. Can you try?
Neuven. Beat Neuven. Neuven.
There you go. Beat Neuven. Stayed in North Omaha in the 1820s. He stayed up at the old Cabinet's trading post that was on Ponca Creek at the river. Kellam Elementary School is the alma mater of Fred Astaire, Gail Sayers, and Bob Gibson, as well as youth programs once led by Whitney Young. Whitney Young was a national civil rights leader who started his career in Omaha at the Omaha Urban League. The Notre Dame Academy and Convent in Florence was built for a group of Czech sisters who came to Omaha in 1908 to teach Czech culture and language after local Catholic leaders requested them. How about that? Your Czech roots of Florence. Notorious Madam, meaning a person, a business owner, had a 6-foot deep concrete slab poured over her grave in 1911. So Omaha's wealthy wouldn't have her dug up and moved from North Omaha's Prospect Hill Cemetery. Now, there are people with the cemetery right now who negate this. They say that's just a urban legend, but hey, I'm game for a good urban legend every now and then. And then now seriously, the newspapers reported it. So nobody's excavated it yet to find out if that's inaccurate.
Is that Anna Wilson?
Go ahead.
Is that Anna Wilson?
That was Anna Wilson. Now, another fun fact.
You can see the slab. It's surface level. It's a big line.
Okay.
I've been by that plot.
So that said,
Her male friend is right next to her, I think.
that's right, James Allen. He was a gambler.
Yep.
But the fun part about Anna Wilson that isn't right here is that she actually bought one of the mansions in Coots Place and had lived there to the end of her life, and then donated that mansion to the Omaha Home for the Elderly, which eventually ended up on Fontenelle Boulevard. But in the meantime, her mansion was part of that process in Coots Place. So anyway, the last one right here, the city of Omaha, it was a couple of years ago, they renamed North Omaha Street after George Will Parker, a self-professed black radical dedicated to black nationalism. So that's Parker Street, and they rededicated the street to him specifically. Dun dun. All right, here's some people. Everyday people, spectacular people, leaders, exceptional, all North Omahans. On the left-hand side, you have, this man was called Professor Waddle. Josiah Waddle was a Civil War veteran and one of the longest living Civil War veterans in Nebraska. But one of the most important contributions that he made to Omaha was that he actually founded on two separate occasions, all-women bands. He was a big musician. He taught music for more than 40 years in North Omaha. And he formed these all-women bands, the first one in the 1910s, the second one in the 1920s, and supposedly the first all-female bands in the entire country was the claim that was made at the time. The grainy newspaper picture up to the upper left, or just, anyway. Yeah, that guy with the mustache. That's Fritz Prees. Does anybody remember the story of Fritz Prees? All right, Fritz Prees was a businessman himself. He was a Scandinavian of some kind. I don't remember which kind. But he moved to the United States and joined the Civil War fight, and then eventually got to Nebraska. He homesteaded in the Ponca Hills, and he had a little tract of land that was up by Oak Ridge Drive and the River Road. And if you look today, you can still see a house that's there. The first floor is in brick, the second floor is in wood. And that house was actually built as a tavern at Prees Lake. This man, Fritz Prees, blocked up a valley in the Ponca Hills and made its own lake. Now, he was kind of a gnarly dude, and there was a lot of stories about him. He built a 7-story house with 1 room per story. He blocked up, he dammed that lake and made the lake for himself. He also had a story where his wife had died, and he buried her, and then a dozen years later, his brother died. And instead of making a new grave, he put the brother in the wife's grave. Yeah, and he was also noted with that same brother, before the brother passed away, he built a flying machine and had the brother test it by jumping out of the tree with the wings on. Heck of a guy. There's a Danish museum in Iowa. Oh, he must be a Dane. Anyway, it's in Iowa, and they celebrate his legacy. He does have patents Fritz Prees has patents in the United States Patent Office. So, interesting guy. Down here in the bottom corner is the board of director of Carver's Savings and Loan. Carver's Savings and Loan was the first ever African-American owned and operated bank. It was located at 24th and Ames. And today, one of the big national banks has uses the space as a Carver institution or some such thing, but they're trying to promote African-American home ownership and savings and different things that way. But this group of people who are there is pretty much a who's who in the 1950s of African-American leaders in North Omaha. We can see Mr. and Mrs. Charles Washington are there. Charles Washington, we're going to read about, or Charles Davis, we're going to read about in a little while. Elizabeth Davis Pittman, Judge Pittman, was the first African-American female judge in Nebraska and a very popular lawyer in her time. Wendell Thomas was a civic leader. Dr. A.B. Pittman was Elizabeth Pittman's husband. He was a veterinarian who had an office on Dodge Street, and that office is actually still standing today, is recognized on the National Register of Historic Places. And Ralph Adams is here. Ralph Adams is one of the children of John Adams, who's also pictured but not mentioned. John Adams Sr. So we met John Adams Jr. just a few minutes ago. John Adams Sr., his father was a minister at St. John's AME Church, but he also took over his son's legislature seat and sat in the seat longer than his son did. His son was in for 1 term. Reverend Adams was in for several terms. So interesting family legacy with them. Does anybody recognize this funky looking dude? Don't be jealous of the mustache. I can hear it right now. This is James Monroe Parker. If you live anywhere from about 480 down to Miller Park, you live on land that might have been owned by Mr. Parker. Mr. Parker's most notable because you can go and visit a facsimile of his apartment today on the upstairs of the Bank of Florence. This is James Monroe Parker, who was the banker at Florence. Now, he did not own the bank. He was a partial operator of it, but he became a very wealthy landowner by investing in the Florence community all the way down to Miller Park. It was his cornfield that was bought in order for Charles Martin to develop Minnelusa. So, interesting dude. This is a picture of him as a young man. I usually use a picture of him as an old man. His facial hair became wild and long, so it's very exciting. Hey, this is Frank Red Perkins, 1890 to 1976. Red Perkins was the only African-American musician from North Omaha to record before 1950. So you'll hear names of musicians thrown around a lot, but it was Red Perkins who really set the pattern that the others followed. His band was called the Dixie Ramblers, and then he had another one called Red Perkins Orchestra, and they toured the Midwest. When they were a barnstorming band, it was sometimes referred to as the Midwest Chitlin Circuit, because African-American performers were brought to perform to all of these different places all around the Midwest, from Illinois to Nebraska, down into Kansas and Missouri, up into Minnesota. And Red Perkins was on that. But he recorded in the early 1930s, actually in 1930, him and his band, they made one record, and you can hear one song from it on YouTube. So definitely worth geeking out on if you're into that. But ragtime music was what they recorded. And then later on, they got deep into jazz and different forms of jazz. Now, here's a hodgepodge of different folks. The big family picture, I have to admit that I assembled this from 3 different images. On the left is Florence. Oh, yes, Florence herself. This is either the niece or the daughter of the woman in the middle, whose name was Eliza Mitchell. Eliza was married to Jim Mitchell. Is anybody familiar with the Mitchell house? It's pictured in the background. Look for that distinguishing feature. Jill, you and I talked about that. That if you take a note right there in the middle of the front porch, you can see the tree jutting up through the porch.
Oh, the tree.
So Jim Mitchell was the guy who put together the Florence Land Company. And the long story short of him is that he was a bit of a visionary. He saw winter quarters. He saw all the cabins and houses left behind, and there were a lot. Those cabins and houses were built between 1846 and 47. The Mormons left en masse. There were about 3,000 to 5,000 people who were at winter quarters. That's a lot of human beings to suddenly show up on an empty plain, essentially, which was what Florence was. It was a high plateau. They showed up there. They built their houses and cabins. None of them intended to stay long. Some of them stayed longer than 1848. That's when the final Mormons supposedly pulled out, but some stayed. Jim Mitchell had been living over in Canesville, which was the early name for Council Bluffs. He'd been living over there, and he saw all the development that they did. He saw a lot of people pull away, and he said, hey, I can make a buck. So he was chomping at the bit for the Nebraska territory to open up. He waited several years, but there are stories that he went over to Nebraska, that he lived on the Nebraska side before the territory formally opened up, and that he even built this cabin early on. The original mythology of this particular house was that it was actually built by Brigham Young in 1846 when he was leading the band of Mormons west. So the story's kind of hallowed, and different people jostle around different things. There's new research that's being done all the time to prove or disprove, and I'm not going to stand one way or the other on it. I just put the picture of the family in front of their house. I thought it was kind of cutesy. That address, if you recognize it, is at 31st and State Street. Yep, right where the Presbyterian Church is. Their house was on the corner, and the Presbyterian Church was originally built next to it. You can actually see on the right-hand corner of this photo, I'm sorry, my right, your right. You see the little brickwork that's behind the house on the side of the picture? There's a branch hanging down over it. Anyhow, that's the church. You can look at the church and see that right now, that corner. Okay, in the opposite corner of the slide, you see 2 individuals, one holding a paper for the other. That is Mrs. Lucy Gamble Williams. Lucy Gamble was the first ever African-American teacher in Omaha Public Schools. She got hired in 1896 to teach at the old Dodge Street School. I've talked about her in my presentation on the history of schools in Omaha, but I think she's a fascinating person. Her husband was Reverend John Albert Williams. I don't have a photo of him in this slideshow, but Reverend Williams was a fascinating man who did spectacular things, and including starting a church, starting a newspaper. He was just the man around town. He was a very loud civil rights activist who accomplished some really cool things. He was almost single-handedly responsible for founding Omaha's NAACP chapter. So definitely an honorable man, and his wife was a spectacular community leader in her own. Standing next to her is a younger man. This is Dr. Eugene Skinner. Dr. Skinner was the first ever African-American principal in Omaha Public Schools, and he became the first ever African-American district administrator in the district as well. Above them is Ms. Florentine Pinkston. Ms. Pinkston ran a very popular music school in North Omaha over by 24th and Lake, and was a really revered leader for a long time. Very honorable person. Give me just one second here. All right. Here's another. Did you know? Did you know Wild Bill Hickok? Lots of people know that name. He rehearsed his Wild West show and performed, I found out, the first pay version of his Wild West show in North Omaha in 1883. It wasn't necessarily from North Omaha, but I thought I'd throw that in because it's fun. At 24th and Ames, that's where the track was. And they did the Wild West show there. North Omaha's Lloyd Hunter played trumpet and led a big band for 38 years. He recorded after Red Perkins did, and was only recorded once by what was called a race record label. That's code word for Black people, race records. And so Dr. George Miller, we're going to see him again in a minute, but Dr. George Miller was the namesake of Miller Park neighborhood and Miller Park Elementary School. He was called a raving maniac by the Omaha World Herald. Now, there's a reason for that, and I'll reveal it in a few minutes. In 1884, Matthew Ricketts became the first ever African-American to graduate from the University of Nebraska College of Medicine. In 1892, he became the first African-American to be elected to the Nebraska legislature. I'm going to share a few more things about him in a minute. And I just mentioned Reverend John Albert Williams, who led a church, started a newspaper, established an Omaha NAACP, and I say much more over his 50-year career. I think that a biography, a full-length 200, 300-page book could be written about Dr. Williams, or I'm sorry, Reverend Williams. He was actually Reverend Dr. Williams, but fascinating man, just accomplished so much and stood up for so many things. On the left-hand side, does anybody recognize this character? The gentleman wearing the suit and tie. Yeah, he'd be your left too. Anybody recognize him? If you were alive in Omaha in the 70s and 80s, you might have watched his TV show. The whole time you might have read his articles in the Omaha Star if you were a reader. In the 1950s, he was a young man when he started out for the Star, where he was their first ever sports. He was their youngest ever sports editor. He's Charles Washington. And today, the North Library at 29th and Ames is named after him. Charles Washington was also a huge civil rights figure in Omaha and was responsible for a lot of different things, including asking and getting Malcolm X to come and talk in Omaha in 1963. In the middle is Ed Prattle. Does anybody know who Ed Prattle was? Again, all different kinds of community leaders in North Omaha. Prattle had a supermarket behind Fort Omaha. The building's still standing today, kind of a random include, but I thought it was a good picture. And I wanted to see, a lot of people know Prattle's name and knew his store. It was just a little neighborhood store. Now it would be, comparable to a convenience store. But back then, that's how you got it. He had deliveries and all kinds of things that he did. And then to the right is Dr. Matthew Ricketts. Ricketts was the first ever certified African-American doctor in Omaha. There was another Black doctor in Omaha before him, Dr. Stevenson. But Ricketts also joined the legislature and then stayed active in Omaha in the 1890s. He left and moved to St. Joseph, Missouri at the turn of the 20th century. This is a study in cool old clothes right here. I wanted to make an admission at the beginning of the slideshow, but given the nature of the conversation, it's obvious now. Almost all the photos here are in black and white. I mean, I try as I may, but sometimes the colorized AI just doesn't entertain me. And in this way, it doesn't. I like these old black and whites. I think they're neat. On the far left side, this is Alvin Saunders. Anybody know who Alvin Saunders was? Okay. Does anybody know what 24th Street was originally called before it was called 24th Street? Okay. Saunders Street. And it was named in honor of the last ever Nebraska Territory Governor, Alvin Saunders. Now, why was he included on this, Adam? Well, not just for his street, but also because he had a mansion. And I'm not talking about a little house with a few bricks. I'm talking about a massive mug that was over at 16th and Grace. This mansion eventually became the German old folks home, and after that became a social service agency. Before that was a Salvation Army hospital. It was that big. And Alvin Saunders lived there throughout his life. He built it and lived there throughout his life into the 1890s. The mansion itself stood into the 1970s before it was demolished over at 16th and Grace. In the middle is a man named Lewis Washington. Now, I'm going to guess that nobody here knows who Lewis Washington was. But in his day, Lewis Washington was a freedom seeker who left enslavement in Washington, D.C. in the 1840s. He was picked up on the abolitionist circuit as a powerful speaker. And for more than 20 years, including after the Civil War, he spoke against enslavement all throughout the Northeast. He was a big speaker in New York. They had these abolitionist circuits where they moved speakers from city to city, town to town. And sometimes it was wide open and just great. Other times it was kind of discreet and undercover, depending on the safety of a given town. Lewis Washington faced a lot, and his life was threatened in New York. So in the 1850s, he went to Wisconsin, and he started doing the abolitionist speaking circuit there. Spent another 10 years there until the end of the war. And then eventually he ended up homesteading in the middle of Nebraska. He did that for about 5 or 6 years before he gave up and came to Omaha and lived out the rest of his life in Omaha from the 1870s all the way until almost 1900. A very popular speaker. But one of the most interesting things about Lewis Washington's life is that in the 1880s, after living in Omaha for a little while, he became a Democrat. Now, forget any politics current. I don't care. I don't want to talk about it. But back then, politics was a different ball of wax for a couple of reasons, not the least of which being that the Republicans were progressives. They believed that the country needed to move forward and believe in the federal government. The Democrats were conservatives. They believed that the country needed to stay the same for the benefit of all the states' rights. That changed in the 1920s. But before the 1920s, if you were an African-American man or woman who identified with the Democratic Party, it wasn't popular. That was not a cool thing to do because they weren't progressives. Democrats were the ones who fought for enslavement. Democrats were the ones who fought against liberty. Republicans were the ones who, oh wait, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. This is why. So that Lewis Washington, a formerly enslaved man, identified as a Democrat and voted as a Democrat and went to Democratic Party events. This is pretty radical for his time. Then on the far left is Ophelia Cleveland's. Ophelia Cleveland's, powerhouse of a human being. In 1898, she worked with a group of African-American women across the United States to start the Afro-American Women's Club. They had chapters all across the country, and at their peak, there might have been 500,000 members. But Ophelia lived in North Omaha. So one of our community leaders right there. Now, I started this thing a couple months ago that I'm calling Reclaiming Omaha History, and I'm still working with it, trying to figure out what I'm doing with it. But the point is to bring some of these stories back out into the light. And here are two of the stories that I featured. I do all the social media, and here are two of the stories that I featured. I've talked about John Adams Sr. He was the 7th African-American legislator in Nebraska. And he served the 5th district as a Republican from 49 to 62. He was also an attorney and a minister at St. John's Church. Just bringing these stories out, reclaiming this history. On the right-hand side is John W. Long, who was the 4th African-American to serve as the inspector of weights and measures for the city of Omaha in 1897. He served under Republican mayor until 1900. Now, the reason why I wanted to include Mr. Long here is that he was the 4th out of 18 African-Americans hired in a row from the 1890s until the 1960s for this one specific job, the inspector of weights and measures. I just uncovered this in the last couple of months. I got really excited about it. But the long story short is this one specific position was kept by Omaha mayors of both parties for more than 70 years to be held only by African-American men. It's what's called I'm going to lose the term. Anyway, the position was a reward for these African-American men who could rally their community members, other African-Americans, to vote for the mayor that was getting into office. And the person who the mayor thought was most influential would get this job. Right? And that's at a time when the city of Omaha did not hire African-Americans. So, an interesting little anomaly and something I want to explore more. But John Long was a part of that legacy. And then there are other stories. On the left, here's the story of Dorcas Thornton, who was called Dorcas Lewis in his career. Dorcas Thornton was a baseball player in Omaha who played in the 1880s for a baseball team called the Omaha Originals. Now let's put that together again. 1880s, the Omaha Originals. Does anybody know when the sport of baseball started?
Oh, jeez.
1860s. So it took only 15 years, and there might have been baseball in Omaha. I'm still digging it up, and other people are definitely working on it. But yeah, the baseball was popular. It was a whole thing in Omaha back then, and they had an integrated team. Dorcas wasn't the only African American to play for them, but he was definitely the first, and he played for a long time. You could see that he went to work for the United States Rubber Company, which was in Nebraska, in Omaha, and worked there for 47 years. It says among his teammates on the Omaha Originals were the mayor, Dan Butler, Bert Murphy, Fred Knickerbocker, and then a lot of other names that are really interesting and had different roles throughout the city. So Dorcas Thornton. In the upper right-hand corner, I included a drawing, a newspaper drawing, one of those tin types that they did, of a man named Edwin Overall. Edwin Overall, talk about a VIP. Edwin Overall worked to end segregation in Omaha public schools in 1869. So this is something that the city of Omaha's history doesn't include, and it's not in the history books, in the big ones, the popular ones, but definitely something that I've uncovered and I shared in my 2021 book called hashtag Omaha Black History, African American People, Places, and Events in Omaha's History. And Edwin Overall, basically, he was born enslaved in Missouri. And when the man who owned him died, Edwin Overall got his money. He left Missouri and went to Chicago. And in Chicago, he became a recruiter. I'm sorry, first he was a conductor on the Underground Railroad and helped literally hundreds of people are documented as having been helped by Edwin Overall in Chicago, seek freedom. But then the other noted thing in Chicago is that he was a recruiter for the United States Army to get African Americans to join the Civil War battle, the Civil War fights. After that, he came to Omaha, and using some of his fortune, he bought a mining operation down in Plattsmouth. He was the first African American to own a mining operation in Nebraska. Ran it for a bunch of years and basically ran the mine out. It had coal in it and not that much. Nebraska is not a big coal producer. However, he came to Omaha and became the first employee of the United States federal government who was black, who identified as black. Overall stayed active. When he brought his kids to the Omaha public schools in the late 1860s, he discovered that they were going to be sent to what was called the Omaha Colored School, Omaha Jim Crow schools, in 1869. And he immediately went to the school board and said, hey, we're not in the South. This is not Alabama. You cannot do this here. It took him 3 years, and he got dozens of other black parents to join him in forcing the school board to pay attention to them and then to close the Omaha Colored School. And eventually they did in 1871. And that's when black students were first integrated into Omaha's public schools. However, as we know, black schools today are more Omaha schools today are more segregated than they were in 1975 when the U.S. Supreme Court intervened to ensure their integration. That's another story for a different time, though. For good measure, in the bottom right-hand corner, I put a photo of an advertisement for Lane Rexall drug. Lane drug's really popular in a lot of folks' imaginations. In the middle of that is a photo of Harry Lane, who was a businessman who kept his drugstore opened in North Omaha at 24th and Ames. It was there from 1900 to 1976. His daughter-in-law ran it through 76. The store at 16th and Locust closed in 69. These are the people in your neighborhood. In your neighborhood. Oftentimes when I talk about 30th and Ames, these three gentlemen come up. They were the newly elected officers of the North Omaha Business and Professional Association in 1956. This is from the North Omaha Booster newspaper. Dave Peterson on the left was a doctor who had a practice right there at 31st and Ames. Clarence Grobenshorer was the vice president, and Clarence, I believe, owned a gas station at 30th and Ames. And then Sam Constantino Jr. who was a treasurer, had a grocery store that was part of a chain, and that grocery store was at 30th and Meredith. If you look at that spot today, you'll see a laundromat is still in the same store building, and that store building was a Safeway. Betty Taylor's not shown here. Betty Taylor worked for the Kenwood drugstore, all at 30th and Ames. Anybody recognize who's pictured here on the upper left? That's Dr. Lofton. Dr. Lofton's office was at 30th and Laurel for 1,523 years. He was a veterinarian. He was a veterinarian who took care of my family's dogs and cats in the 1980s and 90s. And then when I put his picture up on Facebook, it turns out he took care of thousands of other people's dogs and cats. But the way that he talked to me when I was a kid and loved animals made me feel like he was only talking to me and he was only there for my cat and dog. He was that kind of vet. Very cool dude. Today, the building's in disrepair and needs to be healed. But all the same, it's still there. On the right-hand side is a fascinating man. And I don't know if this picture is entirely accurate, but the long story short, this is Dr. Aaron McMillan. Aaron McMillan's another one of these fascinating characters who was elected to the Nebraska legislature in the late 1920s after John Adams Jr. and before John Adams Sr. Aaron McMillan served in the legislature for 1 year. He was a doctor. He was a physician. But he only served in his legislative term for 1 year because he decided to take a position that was offered to him there's an African-American missionary group that worked nationally in the 1920s from actually the 1890s all the way through the 1960s or 70s. This African-American missionary group, their point was for African-Americans to go back to Africa and do mission work there in the name of the church. And Dr. McMillan was welcomed to go back to Angola and start the first ever hospital in that country. First, though, before he got to Angola, Angola was not a liberated country yet. It was still colonized by Portugal, and he was required to go to Portugal. And he and his wife spent 3 years in Portugal so that he could attend med school there because his American med school wasn't right for Portugal. So he attended med school again in Portugal. He learned Portuguese fluently. His wife learned Portuguese fluently, and then they went to Angola. When they got to Angola, they had 4 kids there. And Dr. McMillan started the institution that became the basis for the entire public health system in Angola and set them decades in front of their other former colonial peers once they were liberated in the 1950s. Dr. Williams's work is still honored in Angola, and I've worked with researchers there to help them understand his life in Omaha, both before and after his time. He spent 25 years in Angola, built a 65-room hospital there with donations from the United States, from African Americans in the United States. He also trained dozens and dozens of nurses and had just this spectacular facility, apparently, and did great things. But in turn, he got back to North Omaha. He retired from missionary work, came back to North Omaha, and decided to start a free hospital in North Omaha. And in the 1950s, Omaha's hospital system was deeply segregated, so it needed a free hospital, but particularly a hospital that would serve African Americans. It was so segregated that Black doctors for more than 60 years were not allowed to practice medicine inside of Omaha's public hospitals or private ones. If they paid enough fees, they could practice in private ones, but mostly Black doctors were allowed to do what they could in their office, and that they had to operate or be in medical facilities. They could come to the door of the hospital, turn over their patient to the hospital to a white doctor, where that African-American patient would receive white doctor service. Dr. McMillan thought that was all bunkus. So he started his own institution at 21st and Grace Street called the People's Hospital. I have an article on People's Hospital on North Omaha history.com that explains the whole thing. But basically, he and his wife, Wilhelmina, ran the hospital for about 5 years before the city of Omaha shut them down for code violations. But the People's Hospital was a Black hospital that served Black patients specifically in North Omaha. And Dr. McMillan was the man behind it. Now, the next fun question is McMillan Junior High, named after Dr. McMillan. And again, the answer is disappointingly not so. Instead, it was named after the first ever principal of North High School. Could we actually ask to have McMillan changed in honor of Dr. McMillan? That'd be cool. Same thing with Adams Park. Let's just do the right thing. Anyway. More of these uncommonly known VIPs from North Omaha. I'll tell you, if you memorize all this, walk out of here, you're the pros. I'm done. On the left, you can see Christine Althouse. Is anybody familiar with the last name Althouse? If you young people were alive in the 1970s, you might remember the name George Althouse. George Althouse was appointed to the legislature in 1970 after Ed Danner passed away suddenly. Althouse served 1 year in the legislature before a new term came along, and he was not reelected. Instead, his position was taken by some young man who was determined to change the system, who ended up becoming Nebraska's longest ever serving legislator, Ernie Chambers. So Ernie beat Christine Althouse's husband for that seat. Christine Althouse and her husband, George, ran a beauty school on North 24th Street called Althouse Beauty School. And the Althouse Beauty School operated for 50, 60 years. I mean, it was a long time institution. The building was just torn down 20 years ago. It was at 24th and Pratt. And lots of people have lots of deep memories about the Althouse Beauty School. If you want to figure out, and I think I've mentioned this to you all before, but for the sake of repeating myself, if you want to figure out a way to ruffle people's feathers, you pose facts in relationship to their memories and see how well that goes. Because sometimes people don't like the facts. It's their memories that are more concrete to them. But regardless, the Althouse Beauty School, 24th and Pratt for 50, 60 years. Spectacular place. This woman in the middle, I am going to admit my guilt. I did not write down her name and I do not remember it. She was a minister at First Universalist Church in the 1880s. And by the word of the Omaha World newspaper, she was the first ever female minister in Omaha. She served at First Universalist Church at 22nd and Lothrop for 2 years, and then she moved on. And she's mentioned in my article about that church, if you want to look up Morning Star Baptist Church, a history of Morning Star Baptist Church. It's a beautiful building from the 1890s, and she preached there. And then on the far right, I mentioned Mr. Davis earlier. Charles Davis was an attorney in North Omaha who was partially responsible for starting the Carver Bank, also called Carver Savings and Loan. He was a dedicated community leader. His daughter, her name was Elizabeth Davis until she got married. Then she became Elizabeth Davis Pittman, and Judge Pittman went on for big fame. But Attorney Davis, Mr. Davis here, he also influenced his daughter to become Omaha's first African-American female lawyer in addition to judge. So pretty influential guy in his own family, but also in the larger community. Now here's the last did you know for the day. Did you know that Ernie Chambers was the star of an Oscar-nominated 1966 documentary called A Time for Burning?
Yep.
If you haven't seen A Time for Burning, guys, seriously, I mean, just spend, it's about 75 minutes, and you can find it online to watch. It's on the Nebraska Public Media website. North Omaha's architect, Cap Wigington, his first name was Clarence. He entered and won national competitions frequently when he didn't have a work to design a building. So Cap Wigington was a young man. He grew up in North Omaha, and he was an African-American, the first ever African-American architect in Omaha. He worked for, apprenticed with Omaha's, one of the most popular architects in Omaha, Thomas Rogers Kimball. And in 1898, Wigington won a medal at the Trans-Mississippian International Exposition for a design that he'd made and some paintings that he did as well. And he was at that point, he was a junior at Central High. He went on and did his apprenticeship and started designing houses in the 1900s, in the first decade of the 1900s of the 20th century. He won a design competition for the Good Housekeeping magazine, and he got more and more popular. He designed at least 12 buildings in North Omaha that I can find, a couple more in South Omaha. And then he was hired by the city of St. Paul to become a civic architect in St. Paul. He went on to design more than 100 civic buildings in St. Paul and is the most popular, recognized as the most popular African-American architect in civic architecture in the United States after he left Omaha. He was inducted into Central High School's Hall of Fame a few years back. Hey, look at that. Lake Street was named for an early judge in the city. This guy's name was George Lake, and he was a judge. He actually, George Lake ordered the first execution in Nebraska history, legal execution. It happened in 1867 at 16th and Wirt Street, actually 14th and Wirt. You can drive to the location today. It's not marked or anything, but if you go to 14th and Wirt, you know that there was a gallows that was built there in 1867 to hang a man named Cyrus Tater, who was a former Kansas legislator who killed his business partner when they left Omaha. They had loaded up their wagons in Omaha. They were going to drive them out to the mining fields in Colorado. Tater killed his business partner, and the law caught up to him outside of Fremont, brought him back to North Omaha, and Lake had him had his gallows built at the scene of the crime, which was right by Carter Lake at that point, at 14th and Wirt. Dun, dun, dun. Anyway, Lake ordered that execution, and he got a street named after him. Oh, he also owned some land. The land was at 20th and Lake. You might remember a school that was right there. Anybody? 20th and Lake? Lake School. Come on now. Here we go. Lake School. Woo! Lake School is very popular for a lot of reasons for a lot of people, and served a big role for a long time. Of course, now it's gone, but all the same. The bottom bullet point here, boys and girls across Nebraska raised more than $10,000 to have their own building built at the 1898 Trans-Mississippi Exposition. True story, the Children's Museum, or I'm sorry, the Children's Building at the Trans-Mississippi Expo was paid for by kids. And we're talking about pennies in 1898, which were like dollars, right? That was a lot of money. These kids did it. They did it all across Nebraska. I thought I'd throw them on here because talk about uncommon VIPs. They showed us this model for young people changing the world that's still going on today. That's a whole different rant, but boy, get me started. Guys, today's presentation is a short one, short and sweet. How long can you talk about people for? To find out more information about anybody that I've talked about today, just go to NorthOmahaHistory.com. And that's it for the presentation. Does anybody have any questions? We could do some Q&A. Open floor. Go ahead.
So there is a brick building on the southwest corner of Miller Park. And I've always heard something like it was a veterinary shop. Is that the one you were talking about?
So a brick building on the southwest corner of Miller Park. I want
On 30th Street.
on which street?
30th.
Yeah, on 30th. Yeah. So
It might be a block south.
Yeah,
It's on Laurel. It's on
that's on Laurel. That's the.
Oh, that's for.
that's
okay,
the
so-
veterinarian.
Okay.
30th and Laurel. Because the southwest corner of 30th and Miller Park is the old gas station, the old Phillips
It was,
60.
used to be across from Cliff's Corner, the little convenience store.
Yep, that was Dr. Lofton's office. Before that, it was a grocery store. It was a Craddock's bicycle shop, and before that, it was a grocery store. Anything else? Open floor. Let's just do this. We got time.
You skipped the bullet point about Poppleton.
Did I?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, right there. All right, bullet point number 3. Pioneer Omaha lawyer A.J. Poppleton had an estate in North Omaha. Now, the thing is, he's not uncommon. I mean, obviously, he has a street named after him. He's not doing bad. But people don't associate Poppleton with North Omaha. And in reality, his estate was in North Omaha for like 40 years. It had a giant mansion on it. I've got a picture of it. I've actually written an article about it on North Omaha history. So if you want to get the details on it, but one of the fun facts about it was that after Poppleton died, he had a big library for the time, which was about 1,000 books. I think I have 1,000 books on one of my shelves downstairs out of like 5, but that's a different story. Anyway, Poppleton, his library became the like base of books, the first real collection of books that the city of Omaha had for the Omaha Public Library. So Poppleton's books became the Omaha Public Library books. And that's how the public library got started, was with that donation. The other fun fact about his place is that after he died, after his wife died, it became a sanitarium. Dum, dum, dum. However, sanitarium didn't have the negative connotation back then that we think of now. It's not just, it wasn't this is not politically correct, but it wasn't a loony house or anything. A sanitarium was just a private hospital, and they specialized sometimes in mental health issues, but sometimes in curing your skin problems or getting your bones straight or whatever shenanigans they did back then. So
Adam, where was Poppleton's estate located at, basically in North Omaha?
16th and Yates, Yates, which is over by Grace. It's south of Locust, north of Lake.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. And if you can, I mean, just for our imaginations, just to kind of play this out, 16th Street looked a way that we cannot envision today. Guys, it's really hard for us to grok what 16th Street was. But the long story short, you picture the east side of 16th. For 50 years, from the 1870s all the way until the 1920s, there were big mansions on the east side of 16th Street. Because that was all cleared away behind it, and it looked out over the river.
Right.
So if you're going to have a country estate, what better place to have it than looking over the pretty river? Exactly. So then those estates eventually were torn down, and in their place was built big old apartment buildings. Today we have about 4 or 5 of them left. Bentner Court, Ernie Chambers Court, the Sherman. But at one point, there were 24 huge apartment complexes for their times, huge, all along 16th Street from coming all the way north up to Lothrop Street or Locust Street. And these huge apartment buildings had dozens of people living in them. There were streetcars shooting up and down the street. There were restaurants and bars and grocery stores. And 16th Street was vibrant. That's not even the right word. But the long story short that I'll sum up on that is at NorthOmahaHistory.com, you can find my article about 16th Street where I show a lot of these different mansions and huge apartment buildings and streetcars and all the funky, cool stuff. The other thing to note about 16th Street back in the day is that it was deeply segregated. It was the color line that African Americans were not allowed to go past all the way into the 1950s. So let's just be really clear that that segregation, that housing segregation, but also living segregation was very real in that part of Omaha. What else?
So Adam, having a very short history of only 35 years in North Omaha, I recently learned that Mr. Haynes, the principal of North Omaha, who I'd only ever heard his name associated with North, was a teacher and coach at Tech.
So back when I went to North High School 30 years ago, Brother Haynes would call me out. Brother Sasse, you getting this class? No, Mr. Haynes, I'm just messing around. Hit the bricks. Let's go. And he was a fascinating man back then because I was well aware of how big the school was. But he could see my brother who had left the school 3 or 4 years earlier than me and say, hey, what are you doing there, brother Fletcher? You got to get back to school. And my brother kind of blow him off and move on. But that he could remember everybody. It seemed like, and he did, just this photographic memory for faces and names, and always made us feel, I don't know if welcome is the right word, but you knew you belonged, right? You always knew you belonged.
And he still does it at the football games.
It's just,
all those
there you go.
kids.
It's incredible. But yeah, he was at Tech. He actually coached the basketball team, took him to state and did some powerful things. Tech closed down in '84. And Brother Haynes just transferred from Tech up to North and kept that career going. And what a heck of a role model. What a heck of a under-acknowledged leader for the entire community. I look forward to seeing Haynes High School at some point.
He's been named a Viking of distinction this year.
You know, so that's a start. Let's get some more going for him. What else is on your mind? What else are you thinking about?
Adam, this is Bill Moorhead, retired Lutheran pastor.
Hi, Bill. How are you doing?
Well, I'm doing okay, thank you.
Good.
I remember when A Time for Burning, that documentary first circulated among Lutheran congregations, even well outside the Omaha area. I grew up in Lawrence, Kansas, and my congregation showed that documentary back in the day. And of course, Lawrence, Kansas is a university town, and our congregation was a campus ministry congregation. So we had people in the congregation that were interested in what was going on in Augustana Lutheran up here. That's where that took place with Pastor
Yep.
Youngdahl.
Yep.
And of course, we were interested in segregation, integration issues, because those issues would boil up every once in a while in Lawrence too. Little did I know at the time that I'd end up being in meetings with Ernie Chambers and on committees with him and talking about things here in Omaha. But yeah, he was, of course, the big piece of that documentary. But that was important among Lutherans back in the day. Now, a lot of times when you mention a time for burning among Lutherans, you kind of get vacant stares. They just don't connect. But I suppose it just fell right, if I can put it that way, to know about it, because my home congregation arranged for the showing of the film.
I have the DVD of it, if anyone would be interested in watching it.
Yeah, it's a fascinating view.
Well, and Bill, I think what I would say, and your insight here is super important on so many levels, but not the least of which being just the history of St. Paul and the way that St. Paul Lutheran lived and moved on in its congregational life as part of that story. And so many Lutheran churches, as well as Methodists and Presbyterians and Episcopalians, moved out of the Black neighborhood when Black people moved in. And they lost whatever kind of capital they could have gained by staying and doing that work with more intention. Reverend Youngdahl, of course, faced it head on and said, you know what, we need to do this intentionally. And regardless of the flaws or the failures that he might have had in that effort, he tried. And that's more than I can give most white Omahans in the 1960s, let alone in the 2020s. I mean, it's such a foreign idea for so many Omahans to integrate, to be together on purpose, whether that's for worship, for learning, for shopping, for hanging out. It's just a hard thing to grok our minds around, because it's like, oh, wait, Black people live here, white people live here, and there do the two roads cross. But Augustana tried in a time when nobody did. So I give them a lot of respect and love for that.
And I think by the actual filming of the documentary and the conversations that Augustana was having, I don't remember the exact year or years of all of that, but I'm fairly certain that Pastor Youngdahl was probably gone from the congregation about 2 years later.
He was. And that was 1966 that they did that work. And it was fascinating work too. I mean, the details of that film really need to be laid out. Maybe you just sparked an idea for me. But the long story short is that they did youth group exchanges. They did choir swaps. They did Bible study sharing. I mean, they attempted so many different things. And it wasn't just with one Black church in North Omaha. They switched around to different congregations as they were accepted and brought in. One of the most popular Black congregations to be involved that was actually featured in the film was Calvin Memorial Presbyterian on 24th and Wirt. Their building's still there and is getting new life now. But back then, it was a radical, far out idea for this all Black congregation to come and interact with this all white congregation in all these different ways. And whether or not it succeeded, that's a different question. But that they did it at all. Again, I think that's what's to be vaunted. That's what's to be held up. Thank you, Bill. It's great to meet you this way. Just as a note, Bill has shared with me some historical information about one of the congregations, one of the Lutheran congregations that was in North Omaha, including old photos. And if any of you have any old photos and want to share, or stories that I need to hear, I'm always open and always welcoming of those. And with that, it is now our time. I want to thank you all for coming today. This was awesome. And I'll see you all again in 2 months-ish. We have the next one scheduled, right, Joe?
Yes, 3 months.
3 months. There we go. You'll get the news and updates from Jill, and I'll put them on Facebook, and we'll see you again next time. Thanks, guys.
See ya.
Bye, everybody.